Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin amma ba'd. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to remind us through the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and in the Quran that there are certain qualities that we need to bring into ourselves. A good human being, a good Muslim, in order for an individual to be one to come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are certain qualities that we need to bring into ourselves that will make us not only better human beings, but will also make us amongst those closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It'll make us beloved to our families, and it'll make us beloved to the people around us. We will feel good about ourselves. And then there's certain attributes, qualities that if they come into us, it makes us bad individuals. It takes us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People begin to dislike us. People begin to dislike what we stand for. And we take a moment to remind ourselves that despite all the difficulties that we go through in our life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to remind us that the qualities that we need to bring into ourselves happen to be prophetic qualities. Kindness, humility, empathy, generosity, gratitude. These are things that we need to bring into ourselves. And as we approach and begin and go through this month of Sha'ban specifically, this is a very auspicious month. It happens to be a month in which the Prophet ﷺ increased his fasting. Some narrations remind us that he would fast throughout the course of the entire month. He encouraged the believers to fast as much as possible. And also, some ulama mention the wisdom behind some of this is that, people begin their worship during the month of Rajab and then slow down in the month of Sha'ban, and as a result of that they're special encouraged to fast in the month of Sha'ban, but also that if you're fasting in the month of Sha'ban, no one around you knows that you happen to be fasting, especially with Ramadan that we're required to fast, so we assume that the vast majority of believers are fasting. But in the month of Sha'ban, we don't assume people are fasting, as a result of which our rewards are increased, insha'Allah. And also that so many people happen to be collectively fasting that as a result of that our fasts become easier. So this happens to be a month of worship. And then there happens to be a night during the course of this month in which we are reminded through so many different narrations and traditions of the Prophet ﷺ that there happens to be some merit to this night. But when we come specifically to the traditions around this night, the narrations around this night, the Nisfu Sha'ban, the middle night of the month of Sha'ban, despite some differences of opinion, but there happens to be some merit around it. And in the vast majority of these narrations, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives the human being, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forgiveness is crucial in our tradition. That Allah forgives, and as soon as an individual is forgiven, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listens to us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers our prayers, because sins happen to be something that withholds the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With seeking forgiveness, those sins are erased, as a result of which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's God's mercy descends upon us. And so we're reminded that this happens to be a night of forgiveness. That it's a night in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing us for the month of Ramadan. But we're also reminded that there are certain types, and again, in the various different narrations, we're reminded that there are certain types of individuals, or certain individuals who have certain actions that as a result of their actions, they won't find this forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the first and the one that's mentioned multiple times is an individual who holds malice against someone else. if you hold hatred in your heart, malice, jealousy against another individual, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not answer our prayers. Our forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not for that individual. And so we take a moment to remind ourselves that as we begin and go through these auspicious months, year after year, opportunity after opportunity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that in addition to all the actions, the physical actions of worship that we do and that we continue to do, we need to focus on our hearts as well. Right? We need to focus what's going through our minds. We need to focus on that which our hearts produce. And we take a moment to remind ourselves that if we want forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we need to take a moment to forgive those around us. If there's anyone who's hurt us, harmed us to the best of our ability, we take a moment to forgive them. And we don't harbor any evil, any malice towards anyone in our hearts. Yes, the wisdom of Allah and the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that different people will be treated differently. Sometimes people will have more. Sometimes people who we may think that don't deserve certain things will have a lot more. People who work very little may have so much that we so desire, and people that are close to us that, whatever. This is the divine wisdom and decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we clean our hearts of any malice and hatred towards others, just so that we can seek and benefit from the forgiveness and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ulama, the scholars, have narrated that there are certain types of individuals whose prayers are withheld, are not answered on auspicious nights. A person who regularly consumes alcohol, an individual who is disobedient to one's parents, right? Disobedient to one's parents. An individual who does not mend ties between family members, right? Breaks ties, spouses not speaking to each other, parents not speaking to children, children not speaking to parents, siblings not speaking to each other. Sometimes we feel like, I'm just avoiding them. It's not good for me. And we understand that. But what we need to do is figure out a healthy way to fix some of these problems, and so that we can find mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our rizq and sustenance is tied to our relations with our blood relations, with our kin. Depending on how we treat our relatives, depending on how we treat our elders and our young, our parents, our children, our siblings, our cousins, our uncles and aunts, our nephews and nieces, our rizq is tied to that, per the teaching of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so as we enter into this month of Sha'ban and go through the month of Sha'ban, and more importantly enter into the month of Ramadan, while we are preparing and endeavoring to seek out this month with all this energy and all this fervor, we're preparing, we're looking at the timetables, we're looking at our travel schedules, we're looking at which masjid I'm going to pray salah at, we're looking at our food schedules, all kinds of things that we prepare for. Let's also take a moment to prepare for this month with our hearts, finding a special place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Struggling, fasting is a struggle, right? Staying up at night to pray is a struggle. Yet forgiving someone else is also a struggle. Being kind to certain people is also a struggle, right? Being generous to individuals who may not be so nice to you, either directly or indirectly, is a struggle. But those are also struggles that we need to do in order to prepare for this beautiful month of Ramadan. To be humble, right? To be grateful against all odds. There's a lot going on. Sometimes we ask ourselves how, and we continue to remind ourselves that one of the greatest qualities that Allah loves and encourages is humility. Let us be humble before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that everything that I have comes from Allah. If Allah chooses to take it away at any given time, it can be taken away from me. But to be humble, to begin this month in a state of humility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a state of gratitude that Allah has given me once again this opportunity to be so close to and to be able to enter into the month of Ramadan. and continuously on a daily basis seek out what's going through our minds and our hearts, making sure that our thoughts are pure, making sure that our desires for others happen to be pure, right? And when we are able to do this, when we're able to make this struggle, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, right? Whosoever struggles in our path, we open the ways for them. And when we desire, when we intend to struggle, in order to ensure that our hearts are clean and purified, are free of any evil thoughts, then we will find certain treasures, a certain solace, a certain blessing, a certain divine rain of blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm sure we've all experienced at some point in our lives. And we need to go back to that. And so we take a moment to remind ourselves that these days and nights are extremely auspicious. And as we continue to prepare physically for these months, we take a moment to prepare for them spiritually, right? Spiritually. And rather than looking at others and pointing fingers at others, look into ourselves. Say, what can I do differently this month in order to make it a better month? Is there someone whom I have harmed that I should seek forgiveness from? Is there someone who has harmed me that maybe I can figure out a way to be nice to them in some way, shape, or form? Right? Go out of your way, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will go out of His way. And so when we talk about qualities, certain qualities, there are certain qualities that we need to bring into ourselves. And as we focus on everything else, let's focus on some of these, right? The purification of the heart is so powerful and brings about gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are unimaginable. And each individual has their own unique challenge that others don't have. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make these months auspicious for all of us and allow us to enter into the month of Ramadan with His divine mercy and divine blessings. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.